Owning a home in a lot of countries is really, really difficult these days. But in Singapore, 90% of Singaporean citizens do own their own home. So what are they doing that's right? How are they doing it? And importantly, why can't we do that? So as many of us know, home ownership rates in a lot of countries, like where I am in New Zealand, are declining. In New Zealand before 1991, it used to be around about 75% of New Zealanders owned their home. These days it's about 62%, and it looks like it's pretty similar in Australia. I'm not too sure about Canada. I've read a little bit about the States and it seems to be stagnant. It's around that 60 something percent, 64, 65%. I think it's kind of similar in the UK too. But the trend in many of these countries has been that it's been going down steadily. It's quite common, at least here, to see house prices that are in excess of 8 to 12 times your annual income. And I believe about 50, 60 years ago, it used to be around about 2 to 3, well, 3 or 4 at max. I'm going to talk about how I feel like the housing crisis in these countries is kind of the root cause of a lot of our problems. And I'm going to compare a lot to a place like Singapore, which has, on the surface, done a lot of good stuff to fix that problem. So what's caused this decline? Well, basically, I think the number one culprit is speculation. In a lot of countries that I've just talked about, housing is seen as an asset vehicle, an investment, and you want your investments to go up in value. Basically, the situation we've got in a lot of these countries is a situation where so many people's investments, their money is tied up in property, either in the house that they're living in or they've got a whole portfolio of properties. So let's talk about Singapore. Now on this channel, I've banged on a little bit about Singapore before because it's one of the countries I've been to quite a lot over the years, but I came across some interesting research online recently that shows that 90% of Singaporeans own their own home. And that's pretty incredible when you compare it to other countries that I've mentioned where it seems to be around the low 60s, and that seems to be going down each year. So how do they do that? What are they doing? What have they done? And more importantly, could we do the same? Well, let me share with you some of the little bits and pieces I've learned about Singapore's housing system. It's pretty interesting stuff. In Singapore, housing is part of the entire social security system. Basically, they've got this department called the Housing Development Board. Housing and Development Board is known as HDB for short. The HDB is responsible for building and planning most of Singapore's housing. You've got a situation in Singapore where the government actually owns the vast majority of the land. I forget the exact percentage, but private land ownership is pretty low. Now, HDB owns the land, but you can buy a lease, and I believe these leases last for 99 years. And from what I've found out is that all Singapore citizens have to pay a certain percentage of their income into like a social security tax pot. These payments pay for things like healthcare, pension, and housing. The system is not for profit, which is a massive, massive difference straight off the bat from other countries. This not-for-profit HDB system is a core piece of Singapore's society, constitution, whatever you might call it. And I don't need to tell you how incredibly successful the country is. So successful, in fact, that they're actually facing one of their own housing crises of a slightly different making when compared to places like my country here in New Zealand. Basically, Singapore is so successful now that so many people want to come and live and work there, and it's a tiny place geographically, and they just don't have enough space. The government is still, of course, trying to build as many places as it can to house all these people coming in, but it's happening pretty fast, and that demand just keeps going up and up, and prices are increasing there too. Nevertheless, they're still sitting at 90% home ownership rate for their citizens, which begs the question now, could we do that here? So if Singapore's got it all sorted out, why don't other countries just copy their system and problem solved, right? It's not that simple, obviously. I mean, you can't just copy paste another country's system into another country. Needless to say, Singapore is a very unique place. It's a very small place geographically. Culturally, it's very, very different to a lot of Western countries as well. For anybody watching who has been to Singapore, one thing you'll notice about the place is how strict it is there. There are sometimes seemingly quite petty rules and laws for everything, and probably the most famous being the chewing gum thing. Chewing gum is banned there, vaping is banned there. It is a very, very regulated place. And I feel like that's not going to work in a lot of other societies where we're used to having a lot of our own sort of freedoms, if you know what I mean. But the main reason why we can't just copy Singapore's system in other countries is probably because we've just spent decades now treating housing like an asset. You know, here in New Zealand, and tell me if it's similar in your country as well, the government's created a system where it's quite easy to use housing as a speculative asset class. There's no capital gains tax in New Zealand, so yeah, if you buy a house and flip it for 20-30% profit in a few years' time, then you don't pay any tax on that profit. So immediately it's already quite an attractive investment if you look at it from that perspective. And culturally, the society here has adapted to that as well. It's just considered normal now that a house is something that you could strive to not just live in, but rent it out for profit. And that's why you've seen in recent years more and more people own entire portfolios of residential properties. There's not a lot of investment in other classes. At least I don't see that here in New Zealand. Housing is the number one investment vehicle, and it's always in the media, it's all over TV, and it's what people talk about a lot around the water cooler as well. So yeah, you've got this environment where housing is the number one investment vehicle by far, and it's quite hard to move away from that. I lived away from my home country. I lived in Asia for 20 years total. I lived in Korea for a year. I lived in Japan for 19 years. Before I left to go on these travels, buying a house was one of those things I never really thought about. I don't know if other people did, but from my point of view, it was just kind of a given. It was just one of those things that like, yeah, you know, I'll travel for a few years, I'll come back, I'll work a little bit, and I'll buy a house. No big deal, right? But in that time that I was gone, I've seen buying a house become this huge ordeal, and it's become incredibly competitive. The prices have just kept going up and up and up. I think before I left New Zealand in the early 2000s, the average house price in my area was around about 250 to 300,000 New Zealand dollars. I think that's at the time that was around about I don't know, 150,000 US dollars. Now it's just under $1 million New Zealand dollars, and I think nationwide it's about $1 million, just over $1 million, something like that. So yeah, it's become this massive issue. It's really shifted my attitude on a lot of things. I'm no expert on it, but I've always considered that free market is a good thing, generally. But I reckon it's not really as clear cut as that. Seeing the problems we've got with housing these days, I really think that there are some things that you just don't want the free market to run totally free on. Things like housing, for instance. I think housing should be quite regulated. And in that sense, I think Singapore's got it right. One other thing I will say about the Singapore system is that it's obviously not perfect. And I hope that some people from Singapore do see this video, because I would love to hear from you guys what problems you're having over there. And I know there are some. Even with laws over there, like you can only own one HDB apartment at a time, to keep speculation under wraps, rising prices are still a problem over there. This whole topic has also made me think a lot about the flow-on effects that rising housing costs have on society. I mean, the more expensive housing gets, the more difficult it is for retired people, for instance, to be secure in their retirement. Then there's deeper societal issues, things like crime. Rising housing costs exacerbates the whole poverty situation. The higher the costs get, the more it squeezes, especially low-income families. You get situations where these people can't afford to settle in an area for very long. That has knock-on effects with their kids. Maybe they can't spend much time in one school, they're moving around a lot. And over time, that's just damaging your whole society. The more observant of you will notice that I'm in a completely different environment recording the rest of this video now, because we had a massive, massive downpour where I was recording earlier. Actually, it's quite fitting that I was talking about Singapore, because that rain, no joke, reminded me exactly of the type of heavy squalls you get in Singapore. It was quite something. So anyway, let's get back on topic. There are also several economic factors to take in consideration when you've got a society where housing costs are getting way too high. Now, I'm not too sure where you're watching this from, but here in New Zealand, the media often talks about New Zealand's productivity and how it just isn't that good. I don't pretend to be an economist. There are probably several reasons why our productivity is kind of flagging, but I do know that one of the reasons I hear quite often is because we have just too much money tied up in the property market. Instead of spending our money on, say, investing in new businesses, new ideas, we're just continuing to buy houses, wait for them to go up in value, and then sell it for a profit. When you contrast that with a place like Singapore, and again, I've been there a few times now. The first time I went there, I learned quite quickly that it's a very fast-paced, very entrepreneurial culture there. And quite importantly, Singaporeans are big into investing. And I think that's because they've mostly got housing sorted. I won't say they're free of speculation, but compared to other countries, they seem to be in a much, much better situation. So if you don't have much of a speculative house market just dominating your economy, then you're going to be seeking returns from other sources. And what do a lot of Singaporeans do? They invest in the stock market. Anyway, without going into too much detail about it, I think one of the reasons why a place like Singapore is so successful economically these days, they see the value in starting new businesses and putting money into startups. And just the feeling I get every time I go there, I just see new businesses pop up all the time, or you just flick on the TV in the evening very quickly, and there's always a story about a new business opening up, a new chain opening up. There's a lot of drive, there's a lot of economic drive there. When I compare that to here, things are quite different. It's anecdotal, but every now and then I'll get into a little bit of a chat about investing. And some of my friends or colleagues might ask me, oh, what do you invest in? The stock market? Oh, that sounds a bit dangerous. Isn't that risky? And it makes me feel like there's not a lot of knowledge about investing or investing in the stock market here. And if there was, maybe we'd be investing a little bit more into that instead of just trying to flip houses all the time. It's really interesting. I've talked to a few people who own houses here. They're landlords. They rent their place out. And they often complain about, like, I'm not really making any money by the time I pay insurance, pay all the maintenance bills, etc., pay my property manager. I make a couple of $100 profit, if that. So when I hear things like that, I often think, actually, what is the point of property investing anymore? It does seem prohibitively expensive these days. Anyway, in summary, can we copy what Singapore is doing to potentially solve the housing crisis? I don't quite think so, but what I do think we could maybe do is take a few lessons here and there from what they're doing. Maybe governments could spend a little bit more money buying up land to develop housing for low-income families in a non-profit model. I don't know. When I think of my personal situation, and I tie it all back to what the theme of this whole channel I'm making is all about. I can't control the system, but what I can control is positioning myself as best I can within the system. And what that looks like for me is spending more time on building my personal wealth through investing and working on this plan to retire as early as I possibly can in another country. I've talked about retiring to somewhere much cheaper in Southeast Asia. What positioning yourself within your country system looks like for you could be quite different. Anyway, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on this topic. Do you think there's more that your government could do to help solve the housing crisis? If so, what do you think it is? Put your ideas in the comments. Maybe we can have a discussion about it. Thanks for watching.